right. Wow, how am I going to get through this in 27 minutes? Let's see. But you guys should focus here because I'm going to go through a lot of information. So yeah, I had a long personal journey. I was able to biohack my health tremendously. And using precision health was something that was very, very useful for me. I'll go straight to it. The key to longevity. It's my opinion that people need to personalize their approach to longevity, to everything that they're doing, in order to prevent diseases and optimize their health. And you need to know what are your priorities, right? What you're at risk for, where are your weaknesses, and in that way you can not only live longer, but also live healthier, prevent diseases, and things like that. So I'm a very big believer that no one size fits all. And my paradigm, genetics is an important factor when you want to personalize lab tests, blood tests, and lifestyle and environmental information. So you want to take information from all three sources and integrate that together. So now, number one is, how do you find out what your genetic weaknesses are? So let's first go with how genetics could be used, right? So number one is, you could use genetics to actually help predict what you're at risk for in the future. It's important that it's a very complex science, and so you need to really be looking at a lot of data for this, but the technology exists now for pretty decent predictions. So, and then the other thing you could do with your DNA is also prioritize recommendations based on your DNA. Recommendations should not be solely based on single variants or anything like that. And you need to pick your battles. A lot of people think like, okay, what are recommendations for all my genes? Like, tell me what I need to know. Doesn't work like that. You need to focus on one topic at a time in order to, optimize that topic and get the best recommendations there. I'm not a believer of like, let me optimize everything at once. You pick a topic, focus in on that. If you have a health issue, if you have risk for a health issue, you want to focus in on that, right? If your parents if you had genetic risks, if you have lab markers that are out of optimal range that are predisposing you to something, if you have a current issue, that's going to be the most important. Impact of individual SNPs is very small. If anyone looks at SNPs, they might see like there's a certain risk for a SNP, but that's actually usually quite overinflated because when these studies are done, they pick up a lot of information. They're just an association, and so people inherit thousands or millions of variants, genetic variants together. And so looking at one genetic variant is going to be overinflated. This is why you need polygenic risk scoring, which looks at thousands or millions of variants. And then this deals with all the problems related to predictions, like double counting, because variants are often related to each other. This is the only method available. Ancestry is quite important for genetic prediction, so you have to make sure that whatever you're doing is using Ancestry. And there are certain times when you want to look at specific variants in genetics. So ApoE and BRCA are good examples. And and sometimes I develop hypotheses based on genetics, certain variants, especially if I see a variant that's not common. All of the associations match up with me, and I understand that this pathway could be involved in my previous issues. And so I'll give you an example. The cannabinoid receptor was something that was impactful for me, and that has a lot of impacts downstream, like the immune system and things like that. So I'll just give you, people want to know what are some personal discoveries that I figured out with genetics. So I'll give you some examples. This is just what I figured out, certain things that I figured out. Besides all the predictions that I can see and have access to, and and all the recommendations, but some of the so I've had a lot of mental health issues in the past, and for me personally, low serotonin was one of the biggest factors. Lower BDNF and an overactivated HPA axis. So that's a hyperactive nervous system. These things are made worse by inflammation, which I had to deal with in the past, and you can fix it with supplements that lower supplements and lowering inflammation. So these were the genes. The first line is the serotonin-related genes. Then there's BDNF, and these are the HPA axis. So you don't have to know what these things are, but because the software, we have software that makes it simple. But essentially, these were like, I had serotonin issues, and then all these genes actually correlated with that, and that gave me more confidence that I need to target this pathway. And through that, all the mental health issues disappeared, including with when I was taking BDNF and HPA axis. And mental health issues, I think, is key to longevity and health span, because we all know that being happy is the #1 longevity factor. People who are happy live longer, and they're healthier, right? If you're stressed all the time, if you're not able to balance your mental health, then that is going to weigh on your personal health. And a lot of people get health issues after having mental health issues. So I think this is actually quite important with regard to longevity and health span. This is another example I found. I actually was quite sensitive to plastics in fish, dioxins, and that correlated with certain variants of mine. So I took activated charcoal, and that was something that really helped me. I mentioned before, I always had a lot of food sensitivities, so grains, beans, and for me, the Th1, Th17, this is like a part of the immune system, the cannabinoid system. They kind of interrelate there. That was quite important for me. Cholesterol, I have had a high cholesterol, and there's certain genes that actually were more likely that if I ate saturated fat, my cholesterol went down, and if I ate fiber, it did better with me for me, and that actually helped. So these are examples of like me personalizing my approach. I could get into later, whether cholesterol is actually something that causes disease. The short answer is yes. I'll explain why in a bit. People want to know what my top 6 supplements are. So I'm just going to throw it out there because everybody, what are your top supplements? Not necessarily top 6, but these are my top supplements. But these work for me. They're not going to necessarily work for you. So, but everyone asks, so I'm just going to give it out to you, some good information. Pregnenolone, great for motivation. Shilajit, great for mitochondrial health. Thiamine is, for me, a magic potion for my mitochondria, for mental health, for a lot of things. Energy. Rhodiola is good that's one of the things I use for increasing serotonin. It does some other things as well. It balances the HPA axis as well. Resistant starch is really useful for me because it increases butyrate, and that seems to work really, really well in counteracting food sensitivities. It does improve the cannabinoid system, so that could be part of the mechanisms. Bioavailable curcumin and microdosing. So the bioavailable curcumin is really good for inflammation, and the microdosing is really good just for mental health, I think. And and resistant starch is good for quite a lot of things. Like when you increase butyrate, it's the best way to increase butyrate, and that is good for serotonin, a whole bunch of things. And I want to mention one thing with genetics. This is one of the biggest questions people have. Yeah, but what about my genetic expression? Everything that you do is going to change your genetic expression. But you have to understand what your blueprint is in order to know how to change your genetic expression in the best way, right? And so everything here, everything I'm talking about, these are all things that are changing. When you breathe, you're changing your genetic expression. Everything you do is changing your genetic expression all the time. You want to find out what are my tendencies? How do I work in the best way to counteract those negative tendencies or improve the positive tendencies. I wanted to talk about labs. There's a new concept, brand new concept called Mendelian randomization. It's pretty new. How many people here have heard of Mendelian randomization? Oh, we got 2 people. Not bad. Okay. It's a very interesting concept. When we were looking at labs, we were figuring out which labs were actually causal, right? Because if you're testing a lab, it's most important to know if the lab is actually causing an issue and which issues it might be causing in the future, right? Because just changing a lab does not necessarily mean anything. There's some exceptions, I would say. For example, CRP, because it is super connected to inflammation. So if your CRP is higher and you lower that, even though the CRP itself, the C-reactive protein, is not doing anything harmful in your body, based on these studies, but it's a pretty reliable predictor. But in general, you want to look at what are the factors that are actually causing your health issues or increasing your risk. So normally what studies do is they look at observational studies. People with higher levels of this tend to be healthier or lower risk for that. These observational studies are not accurate at all because there's too many confounding variables. So for example, the studies that say, let's say, if you have higher levels of vitamin C, that just means that you're eating more vegetables usually, right? So people with higher dietary intake of vitamin C, there's like all these benefits. And the question is, well, is it the vitamin C or is it the other things that are going along with it, the confounding variables? So how do you determine causality when there's, with labs? So there's 2 main ways, right? So number 1 is sometimes there's clinical trials and interventions. Though that's a very good way to find causality, of course. Sometimes it's not possible, right? Because something is either too long, it's too long of a life cycle. And then there's a new approach called Mendelian randomization that I mentioned, and preferably you want to look at both of these factors. So Mendelian randomization is they look at people who are genetically predisposed to have a higher marker of something. So some people have higher levels naturally of vitamin C. And this is an independent variable because your genetics are causing these higher predisposition rather than eating vegetables, right? And often these things are going to be independent on their own. So if you could see like, okay, I have genetically higher levels of vitamin C, what diseases are people with higher genetically vitamin C, levels of vitamin C? What are they less likely to get? What are they more likely to get? And then you can actually do a clinical trial and give vitamin C and see what happened. So that's a really cool concept in teasing out causation. And they're obviously much better than observational studies. So let's look at some interesting things with Mendelian randomization. And so I'll go through some just basic ones so you get the concept of like, okay, there's something to this. But it is this is a very accepted approach now in finding out cause. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it is a reasonable part of what you want to look at to figure out causation. So glucose, actually having genetically higher levels of glucose increases your risk of diabetes. Nothing too, surprising there. Heart disease, diabetic complications, Alzheimer's, we're not surprised over here, right? Blood pressure, actually people genetically higher predisposition have all these diseases, heart disease, stroke, migraines, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, and reduced longevity, cognitive impairment. If your blood pressure is high, you got to take care of that. That's a lifestyle. You can change that with your lifestyle, and that's one of the biggest factors with longevity. So these are kind of obvious stuff. By the way, all these R's are references. When we give out the slides, people can actually look at the references. So high homocysteine, something that's interesting here is most people think of this as related to heart disease. It's actually not, based on these Mendelian randomization studies. But it is related to cancer, obesity. It does cause, there is some evidence that it causes these things, especially cancer. So homocysteine is also something you can easily get checked and see if you have high levels or not. And if you do, you want to reduce it because it's actually causing cancer. Now, this one has a lot of controversy. IGF-1, this is the hormone that does a lot of things. It's insulin growth factor, causes growth in the body. There are some benefits, but there's a big debate of whether this causes cancer or not. And it turns out that people who have higher levels of IGF-1 actually have higher likelihood of cancer, type 2 diabetes, but they have reduced blood pressure and increased bone density. So there's some benefits, there's some risks. This is an example of you have to know what your goal is, right? If you want to reduce cancer because you have people in your family that had cancer or you have a genetic predisposition for it, then it's something that you want to focus on, right? If not, if you care more about blood pressure, then maybe having higher IGF-1 could be good for you. Okay, so I'll go through quickly some vitamins and minerals because this is interesting, and this kind of gets to the concept of why you need personalization. Because sometimes when you increase a vitamin or a supplement, it could actually increase risk for certain things, and so you want to know what the situation is. Genetically higher vitamin A levels may cause increased longevity and lower chances of osteoarthritis, which could be good. However, on the other hand, beta-carotene, these are the Mendelian randomization studies, and also, in this case, actually some clinical trials. But if you have genetically higher levels of beta-carotene, you're more likely to get ovarian cancer and also bladder, lung, and ovarian cancer. So if that's something that you're predisposed to or something like that, that's something you want to be careful about and track your levels, and also look at what your genetic predispositions are. But essentially, beta-carotene supplements are probably not the best approach. There were some clinical trials there as well. So genetically higher levels of vitamin B12. A lot of people like B12, but people should know that actually it can cause lung cancer. So there's Mendelian randomization study and an observational study as well. And they actually found that increased vitamin B12 intake from food may increase lung cancer. So again, it gets back to personalization, right? What are your goals? For some things, B12 is going to help a lot, right? And you want to, you have to target those goals. You have to see, okay, what are my weaknesses? If you're not predisposed to cancer, taking more, or lung cancer, taking more B12 is not going to make a difference in terms of lung cancer because that's not going to be your issue. Vitamin C, so there is actually a causal association between vitamin C and reduced risk of heart disease and all-cause mortality. Now, vitamin D is an interesting one because a lot of people know about this one. It turns out that if you have genetically higher vitamin D levels, you're lower risk for multiple sclerosis. So that is something that vitamin D is actually causally preventing. Now, and the same thing with Alzheimer's. Now, the thing is that if somebody already has multiple sclerosis, the vitamin D does not actually treat it based on clinical trials. It's just they found that it could help prevent but not treat. So that's something that people also have to keep in mind. Sometimes something can help prevent, not necessarily treat. And this is what it doesn't help with. Basically, a whole bunch of other autoimmune conditions, cancer, heart disease, depression. Never helped with my mental health or autoimmune issues, so I can vouch for that. And it doesn't help with all these issues as well. Again, fatigue, ADHD didn't help mine, so IBD didn't help. But the other ones, myopia didn't help there, yeah. But essentially the other ones, I can't tell you. But based on these causal studies, it's showing that it doesn't help with these things. Now, vitamin E is an interesting one because it's actually, you want to be careful with this one. And again, it's just because we're getting these studies, we can start to see the causal, actually what's causing versus, just what's associated. Because people who are eating foods with higher vitamin E generally will have lower risk because they're healthier foods. You're eating a better diet. But actually, genetically higher vitamin E levels may cause heart disease. And actually, there was some interventional studies too. So there's actually good evidence that higher vitamin E will cause heart disease. So if you're genetically predisposed to heart disease, do not take vitamin E. Now, you want to get normal amounts of it in the food, of course, but do not supplement with it. There are some benefits, higher bone density, but with cardiovascular disease, heart disease, stroke, there's good evidence that it can increase your risk. So again, I want to impress that it's the personalization here. If you try to just follow what someone else is doing, you're going to get the wrong results. Like, I'll just do what this person's doing. They know what they're doing. Well, they have very different genetic profile. They're very different in a lot of ways. So you need something that is personalized for you. You need to get what are your priorities and focus on that. Genetically higher vitamin K levels may be causally associated with stroke and heart attack. So also higher vitamin K, vitamin K helps clotting, and so it seems like it's related. It can cause cardiovascular disease, and it's decreased risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So if you have type 2 diabetes, it might be good. If you have cardiovascular disease, might not be as good. Calcium is a dangerous one a bit, right? So this one also has these Mendelian randomization studies, but also the clinical trials that are backing. And again, I think longevity is not just about what you're taking, it's also what you're not taking. You need to be strategic about what you're doing. So genetically higher levels of calcium is associated with, causally associated with heart disease, stroke, migraines. And actually, with heart disease and, stroke and migraines is actually studies. And heart disease, there's these randomization studies and also supplements increase heart disease risk. So there's double verification there. Higher iron, we know about this. A lot of us know that genetically higher iron levels could cause you to live less long. I mean, I remember there was long debates about iron and longevity. Is it actually causal? Turns out that there is some causal factors to having higher iron levels. Now, again, it's all about balance. You don't want to be anemic, right? But genetically higher levels can cause some issues. There's some benefits too, lower risk of rheumatoid arthritis. And magnesium, we all love magnesium, right? Who doesn't like magnesium? Genetically higher magnesium levels may cause rheumatoid arthritis, bipolar, and breast cancer, although higher intake is associated with lower breast cancer risk because the foods with high magnesium are probably, generally pretty healthy for you, right? So again, but if you are worried about breast cancer, I don't think you should, based on these studies, you should not be supplementing with magnesium. There's a lot of good sides too, so heart disease and atrial fibrillation, so it's pretty good for cardiovascular disease, and also some mental health sometimes it could be pretty good for. Phosphate, this is something if you're worried about breast cancer, you could measure higher risk for breast cancer. We could skip this. Folate is probably not causally, because there's a lot of studies with folate, because it happens to be found in a lot of vegetables and a lot of healthy foods, but it's actually not causally associated with heart disease, allergies, mental health, and blood pressure, cholesterol. But it might help actually prevent schizophrenia, potentially. Selenium. If you have a predisposition for higher blood sugar levels, you want to be careful with this one. This one's pretty decent evidence that it could increase blood sugar, cause insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and maybe prostate cancer. On the upside, it could help bone density, right? So again, there's always positives, there's always negatives. You need to find what is my goal and cater your plan towards that. Sodium, this is a big one. Like this one, every blood test will measure sodium. So it actually could cause heart failure, stroke, and type 2 diabetes risk. and this is related also to, the sodium that you consume in your diet can also increase the sodium in your blood. This is actually urinary sodium, so it'll increase urinary sodium. And then this is hypertension. It is causally associated with that. Okay, so omega-3, I love omega-3. It's great for mental health, but actually it can increase the risk. People with genetically higher levels can increase the risk of colorectal cancer, type 2 diabetes. On the upside, it's great for cardiovascular. I've noticed that. Crohn's disease risk. I think mental health as well, higher bone mineral density. So there's a lot of benefits. One of my favorite supplements. You could get it in fish, but I'm just sensitive to the dioxins in fish. And higher levels of omega-6 could cause some issues, heart disease, colorectal cancer. Now, this is my company, Self-Decode. And so we look at labs, we look at genetics. For prediction, we could show you where your labs are, if they're in the optimal range or not. Now, one thing, I have a little bit of time here, and I wanted to go to LDL cholesterol because this is something that is checked pretty often, but I think it's ignored in the health community a little too much, because there is a debate as like, is the LDL cholesterol actually causal or not? This is one of the things that you will have in every blood test, so that you've ever taken pretty much, and it's a good thing to check. If you have higher levels of LDL cholesterol, based on the Mendelian randomization, so this is actually some of the best evidence because they have clinical trials based on drugs that decrease cholesterol. They have Mendelian randomization, they have observational studies. It almost doesn't get better than LDL cholesterol when you're talking about evidence. But yeah, it's higher levels can cause shorter lifespan, heart disease, heart valve disease, diabetes, stroke, ALS. And then for HDL cholesterol, people, I think, overestimate how good that is. Like, people are like, oh, but my HDL is good. Actually, there's less benefits, causal benefits, than we thought. So higher HDL may actually be causally associated with breast cancer, and it's probably not helping you with heart disease. Based on these Mendelian randomization and clinical trials. So there's good evidence that it actually does not help with heart disease. Okay, my time is up. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. And yeah.